Now, not enough of your American readership knows how you uncovered high-level corruption in Brazil's government. Now, I got the book. I read the preface. All right, I got it yesterday. I read the preface. I'm very proud of myself. So I know, because reading is hard. And can you tell us how your reporting had tremendous political consequences for Brazil, and what you revealed about Bolsonaro's government, and how your reporting literally helped free former President Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party? So tell us the story, Glenn.
Yeah, so in 2019 on Mother's Day, which was a Sunday, I got a call from a famous Brazilian politician named Manuela Dávila, who was a two-term member of Congress. And she was also the candidate who ran as vice president for the Workers' Party against the ticket that lost to Bolsonaro in 2018. So she made the runoff. She was the vice presidential candidate. She's a big deal in Brazil. She called me and she said, "Hey, I need to talk to you urgently. About an hour ago, my telephone was hacked, and the hacker insisted on speaking with me, and he showed me all of these private conversations I had with, close colleagues of mine in the Senate and my party and close friends of mine." And I thought, wow, what is this, like a blackmail scheme, or, what does he want? And she told me, he said, "No, actually, I only did that. I only hacked your phone to prove to you that I have the capability to hack the Telegram accounts of anyone in the world that I want. And I've spent the last several months hacking into the phones of some of the most powerful and influential political officials in Brazil, particularly Sergio Moro, who at the time was the Minister of Justice and Public Security for Jair Bolsonaro, the most popular political official in Brazil, because he was the judge who oversaw the anti-corruption probe that sent Lula to prison. And he said, I have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of documents that prove grave corruption on the part of the most powerful people. And they talked about what they should do with this material. And he asked to speak with me, knowing that I had worked on a similar archive in the Snowden case, doing the NSA reporting. So within about 20 minutes, I was speaking to him by computer, and he told me that he had an enormous archive, that he had hacked into these officials' telephones, and that it would change Brazil forever. It would destabilize the government. It would send people to prison. It would prove that the people who were viewed by the Brazilian media and by the Brazilian government as being the most kind of upstanding and ethical were in fact the most corrupt. So I, kind of kicked the tires as hard as I could to make sure he seemed like a real source. And when I had confidence that he was, I told him to start uploading the documents to my phone, and he said okay, and he began uploading the documents to my phone. And 12 hours later, I went to bed. I woke up the next morning. They were still uploading one after the next. And then the same thing the next day, the same thing the next day. And after 8 days, there was no end in sight. And I realized this archive is going to be bigger than even the Snowden archive, which at that point was the biggest leak in modern journalistic history. And so we created a kind of Dropbox. I was very eager to make sure the documents could be stored safely outside of Brazil so that it was out of the reach of the Bolsonaro government. So even if they got a court order or found out what we were doing, remember, the guy that these documents were about primarily was like the Attorney General. So he's in charge of the equivalent of the FBI, the NSA, all surveillance, all monitoring, all law enforcement, the federal police, like probably the single most powerful official in Brazil. And he used to be the most important judge. So I thought he could get a judicial order at any moment ordering us to not publish these materials, to turn them back. So I wanted them saved outside of Brazil. And we proceeded to go through the archive. And within like the first 24 to 48 hours, we found evidence of immense corruption on the part of that judge and the part of his team of prosecutors, not just in general, but specifically with regard to how they prosecuted Lula. And just a word about that, because this is the most important part of the story, which is that Lula da Silva was the former president of Brazil. He founded the Workers' Party. He was probably the most important center-left or left-wing political leader of the last half of the 20th century, or first half of the 21st century, along with like Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro in terms of consequence and impact, but in terms of political success, probably the most important. He was, a labor leader. He grew up in extreme poverty, was illiterate until he was 10, lost a finger in a factory. And he became president and presided over extreme economic growth, took millions of people out of poverty. And by the end of his 2 terms, when he was term limited out of office in 2010, he left office with an 87% approval rating. And then his handpicked successor, Dilma Rousseff, who was a former Marxist guerrilla, she was imprisoned during the military dictatorship, was elected and then reelected, but then impeached in 2016. So in 2017, everybody knew Lula was going to run for president again. And all polls showed that he had a 15, 20-point lead over every other candidate, including Bolsonaro. He would have been elected easily, these polls showed. And right at that moment, when he was gearing up to run, they brought very dubious corruption charges against him. They cheated to make sure that it stayed in Sergio Moro's court, even though it wasn't supposed to be there. Sergio Moro quickly found him guilty and sentenced him to a decade in prison. And then a appellate court, which was notoriously subservient to Moro, affirmed the conviction. And when they did that, it rendered Lula ineligible to run. He went to prison. So they took Bolsonaro's primary obstacle to the presidency, Lula, out of the running by declaring him guilty, and then Bolsonaro cruised to victory. And the minute Bolsonaro won, the first thing he did is he turned around and rewarded that judge who found Lula guilty by giving him the most powerful ministry in the country, which was the Ministry of Justice and Public Security. And these documents that our source provided us revealed that the entire thing was a fraud and a scam from the start, that they cheated along the way in every step of the way, that it was politically motivated. And just 2 weeks ago, like 3 months after we began our reporting, Lula was freed from prison by the Supreme Court. And then 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court invalidated the criminal convictions of Lula, restored his full political rights on the grounds that Judge Moro had acted corruptly. And that means that Lula is now free to run again in 2022 against Bolsonaro, which everyone expects him to do.
I mean, Glenn, you cannot overstate the impact that your reporting had on the culture of Brazil. You cannot overstate. Reading your book was mind-blowing about how you changed the culture and how people... So this Moro guy, which here's a picture of him, Mike, show everybody. So this here he is, Sergio Moro, and so go back to Glenn. So what this guy, he was like the J. Edgar Hoover but even more powerful than J. Edgar Hoover was in the United States, if people know about his power. So this guy had all this crazy power, and the courts would rule with him, and he was a cultural hero. People thought he was fighting for... And then your reporting revealed the opposite about that guy, that guy was actually corrupt, and he was working in cahoots with this guy. This guy was the lead prosecutor for Lava Jato, and which stands for car wash, but that's where the investigation started. And then it turned out it was a completely corrupt partisan investigation that was going after Lula, who's the left winger, and they were in cahoots. The judge was in cahoots with the prosecutor, and he was showing him how to bring the case so it couldn't be appealed. And they were doing all this, and he was actually doing public crucifixions of the people he was going after, that Moro guy. So you exposed all this, completely changes not only the sentiment of the public, but also the sentiment of the Supreme Court inside Brazil, then started ruling against him. And to the point where now Lula's conviction has been overturned. I mean, the turnaround that has happened while Bolsonaro is still there, you can't overstate it. Now, what was more dangerous, going against Judge Sergio Moro or exposing Bolsonaro?
Well, it's interesting because, I remember I told the story in the book, when Manuela Davila called me that day about the source, I said, listen, do you mind if David, my husband, participates in the call? And she knows David very well. He's a member of Congress with the Socialist Party. And she said yes, and he participated. And David was very involved in the Snowden reporting, too. He was infamously detained at Heathrow Airport under a terrorism law by the British authorities and threatened with prosecution. And so after we got off the call, David sort of jokingly said to me, like, God, is there anyone else they can give these fucking archives to besides you? Like, why does it always have to be you that does them? Because he kind of knew that this is going to be, like bring extreme turmoil to our life. And I had said, look, we already went through the Snowden story, so I feel like we're going to have a big leg up. We already know how to do this. And he said, I think you're being very fucking naive. Remember, this was in May of 2019. So this was 4 months after Bolsonaro was inaugurated. And it wasn't just that Bolsonaro had won the election. It's that his entire right-wing party, far-right party, which barely existed after 2018, they were swept into power. They were the second largest party in the Congress, 1 seat less than the Workers' Party. They were at the peak of their power. They had just won this enormous election. Everyone was petrified of them. And then when you had Sergio Moro, who, was on the Time 100 list in 2016, they talked about him like he was Superman. There were huge murals of him on the side of buildings in every city in Brazil. He was like a religious figure. When he went and he joined the Bolsonaro government, his following and the Bolsonaro movement merged because Moro became crucial to the stability and legitimacy of the Bolsonaro government. So there was really no division between the two. You couldn't talk about, is Sergio Moro the more problematic figure or is Jair Bolsonaro, because they were merged at the hip. They were joined at the hip. Bolsonaro's government depended in a lot of ways on Sergio Moro's popularity. And Moro, by going and joining the Bolsonaro's government, knew that his legacy as a public figure was going to be determined and shaped by the Bolsonaro government. So they were very unified, and so were their rabid followers. So we were really challenging this enormous apparatus, this right-wing faction that had completely taken over Brazil. And, Bolsonaro, for those of you who don't know in your audience, is a figure who, he was a congressman for 30 years, but he got his start as an army captain in the military dictatorship, and has spent 30 years saying the military dictatorship was a superior form of government to democracy. He has an iconic interview where he said if he's ever elected president, the first thing he's going to do is close the Congress and the Supreme Court. He said the only thing the military dictatorship did wrong was it didn't kill enough dissidents. In the campaign, he vowed to shut newspapers and drive out leftists from the country. And so this is the first case of someone kind of challenging this new regime and testing how capable are Brazilian institutions to defend, press freedom rights, defend the right of dissent and free speech, to essentially prevent Bolsonaro from instantly converting Brazil into a full-scale authoritarian or tyrannical government. And so I've always thought Moro was the more dangerous figure, Jimmy, because he's more clever. He's a lawyer. He's a judge by training. He didn't have that kind of clownish buffoon side to him that Trump and Bolsonaro both have. He's a much more serious figure, and he's a much truer believer. He's like this extreme law and order guy. He was sending people to prison for 15 years or 20 years without batting an eyelash. And he's like a sociopath. And so we really believed, and ultimately it turned out to be true, that there were no limits on what those guys would do to try and stop our reporting or punish us for doing it.
And tell us some of the stuff that they did do. Well, what was the personal price that you and your husband and your family had to pay for doing actual journalism? Not you weren't sitting in on a clubhouse chat. You were actually doing journalism. So tell me about that. What was the price that you paid? Were people mean to you on Twitter, or did it get worse?
Yeah, it was a little worse than people were mean to me on Twitter, but it was a little worse than that. Well, so, hovering over this whole thing, and I think I talked about this on your show before, was that just a year earlier in 2018, one of our family's closest friends, Marielle Franco, who was this black LGBT woman from the favela, she got elected along with David to the Rio de Janeiro City Council in 2016. And she became this huge political icon because she got this huge vote. She came from the favela. She had like a child at 19, was a single mother, went back to college, got her master's degree. She was a huge success story, the kind of person who doesn't usually wield power in Brazil. And she sat right next to David every day in the city council. And in 2018, she had left an event And she was riding home in her car, being driven by her driver back home, and a car pulled up beside her, rolled down the window, and pumped 13 bullets into her car, 4 of which entered her skull and killed her immediately, 3 of which entered the back of her driver and killed him immediately as well, which is like one of the most traumatic events of our lives, personally, politically. So there was like a kind of, and it turned out the Bolsonaro family had very close ties to the militia of former police officers and military agents that carried out that assassination. I don't think the Bolsonaros were involved in the assassination, but they have very close ties to that militia. So political violence was hovering the whole time. And early on, like the second or third day, we got a series of death threats that weren't the kind of death threats you get, like if you're a public figure and someone emails you saying, I hope you die, or you're going to get what's coming to you, or you better watch your back, those kind you get every day. It was stuff like that had very non-public information about our home address. There's like the social security number equivalents that we have, where our kids went to school, pictures of like the license plates of our cars. And it said like, you better watch your back. You continue with this reporting and we're going to kill you. So we had to institute a security regimen that lasts to this very day, where we only could drive around in armored vehicles of the kind that would have saved Marielle's life. We can't leave the house without multiple armed guards protecting us, both my husband and myself. You remember the central part of Bolsonaro's movement is an anti-LGBT movement, and my husband and I are probably one of the most, if not the most visible same-sex couples in Brazil. We have 2 children, so we really triggered a visceral hatred on the part of this movement. Shortly, almost every day at the top of Brazil's trending Twitter topics were hashtags calling for my immediate arrest or deportation. There were reports constantly that I was about to be arrested by the federal police under national security laws from the dictatorship era. They leaked that they were conducting an investigation into my finances. And when the Supreme Court intervened and put a stop to it on press freedom grounds, they then instituted a formal financial investigation into David, my husband's finances. Wherever I would go to public events, there'd be huge signs and protests of people carrying banners with my name on it saying, leave Brazil, Glenn Greenwald, national security threat, put him in prison.
So Glenn,
a lot of my events got canceled.
Glenn,
Go ahead.
So the government was literally criminally investigating you, speciously or nefariously. They were investigating you, and then it was so obvious that they were doing this in retaliation for your accurate reporting that the Supreme Court stepped in and made them stop their investigation. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so when it leaked that one of these agencies under Sergio Moro's control, they leaked that they were conducting an investigation. The claim was they wanted to determine whether I had paid the hackers. There was no evidence for that. It was like a crazy right-wing conspiracy theory that I had paid the hackers or had paid Russian hackers in Bitcoin, all kinds of insane stuff. So the pretext was they were investigating to see if I had committed the crime of paying the hackers. Obviously, if I had paid the hackers to do the hacking, I would have been part of the conspiracy. And the Brazilian Supreme Court intervened. A center-left party in Congress went to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to put a stop to that investigation. And they did. And they issued this stirring defense of press freedom, saying that without the ability of reporters and journalists like him to do reporting against powerful people, our democracy is going to die. And so it's a violation of the Brazilian Constitution for you to do retaliatory investigations against him. That was one of the major successes that is a precedent that endures to this day. They, when I would go to public events, a lot of times they would get canceled because of the death threats, and the event organizers didn't feel like they could provide safety. Other times there were extreme security measures. One time I had to just give a speech on a boat offshore, and there were a bunch of Bolsonaro protesters behind me shooting fireworks horizontally at our boat. It set like a banner on fire in the crowd. They forged documents purporting to show that David and I had participated in all kinds of criminality. They were offering money to our friends to say, if you lie about them and talk about their personal lives, we'll pay you, $20,000, $40,000, a lot of money. And then, I got physically attacked on the air once. I got a lot of media attention by this pro-Bolsonaro journalist who had previously said that the state should investigate whether we were taking care of our children or abusing and neglecting them, and whether our adopted children be returned to the orphanage from which we had adopted them. And then when I confronted him with that comment on air, he physically attacked me. And then ultimately, at the beginning of 2020, despite this Brazilian Supreme Court ruling, and despite the federal police conducting this huge investigation, issuing a public report saying they investigated to determine whether I had committed a crime and found no evidence that I was in any way involved in the hacking, these pro-Bolsonaro, pro-Moro prosecutors charged me anyway, along with the 6 people they accused of being the hackers. They claimed they found my sources who did the hacking and arrested them. And they, along with charging them, charged me as part of the conspiracy with 126 felony counts and a 330-year prison sentence. It made headlines around the world. Bernie Sanders, even Elizabeth Warren, Tulsi Gabbard, objected. A lot of press freedom groups, the New York Times, right-wing groups, Tucker Carlson, denounced this. And then about a month later, a judge said, I'm throwing these charges out against Glenn Greenwald because the Brazilian Supreme Court has already said you can't punish him. But the judge, who's a right-wing judge, said, if it weren't for that Supreme Court decision, I would not only accept these charges, I would order him imprisoned preventatively pending trial because of what a danger he is. And now the Bolsonaro government is appealing that dismissal. So they're still trying to imprison me. But, I think at the end of the day, given the fact that we've been so vindicated, that they just reversed Lula's convictions on the grounds of what our reporting showed, it's, I think, inconceivable that they would be able to succeed in imprisoning me, though they're still trying. And, even though it did upend our lives, obviously, it's so gratifying. It's what you go into journalism to do, is stories like this, stories like the Snowden story, to challenge the most powerful actors, to show them what they're hiding, to show their corruption. And when you confront power, this is what happens. This is the definition of power, is if you impede a powerful person's interest, they have the capacity to punish you for doing so or reward you for serving their interests. That's the definition of power. And it's one of the reasons why I have so little patience and so much contempt for this whiny, petulant theme on the part of these digital, coddled, media journalists in Brooklyn who have trauma because someone quote tweets them and have to lock their Twitter account. Journalists used to fucking go to war zones. You were expected to go to prison to protect your sources. Yes. You were expected to take on powerful governments like we did and do this. And they whine about fucking tweets. So, at the end of the day, I feel like the reason I wrote the book is not so much about Brazil, but to really talk about what journalism is in its highest form and why, despite how much we hate the people who call themselves journalists, journalism in its real form remains so important.
Yeah, yes. This story, honest to God, just reading your book, it was mind-blowing. Just the impact that you had. And it is. So, by the way, I wanted to, let me show, can you see my screen? Do you see this guy? That guy was the lead prosecutor. Now, I remember.
Yeah, his name is Delton Dallagnol. He's like, we were with him in Canada, if you recall.
So that's the guy. So when I see this guy, I'm like, fuck, I know this guy, met this guy. So the story, I went to cover to the Allard Prize in Vancouver, and they give out awards for journalists and people who are fighting the power and muckraking, and often being persecuted by their own government for doing their journalism and stuff. So that was a good event. I went. You were the keynote speaker, so you were there. Actually,
correct.
You were actually kind of honoring these guys that you then went on to expose for being corrupt, which was amazing, right? Because one of the weirdest bad faith attacks I ever got was the fact that I covered that Allard Prize and Lava Jato, and then 2 years later, your reporting exposed them, and then people said I was pushing Lava Jato. No, I was at an event.
Yeah, let me just say, because I know I've seen these attacks on you before, and obviously it's often done in the context of my reporting. What happened was at the time. You have to understand, when this investigation began, even Lula says this. He believes that the judge and these prosecutors were well motivated these were like, these are young guys. Look at that guy. He was like 34 when he became the chief of the prosecutorial task force. Judge Morrow was in his like early 40s to mid 40s. So these were the guys who were like of the first generation that were really born into Brazilian democracy, who came of age instilled and inculcated with democratic values, not people who grew up in the military dictatorship. And they like wanted to clean up their society. They wanted to clean up Brazil from the systemic corruption. And it began by them sending like billionaires to prison and like the sleaziest politicians. And there were a lot of people, including on the left, who applauded this at first. And I was one of them. You know, I wrote a book in 2011 called With Liberty and Justice for Some about how in America, the richest and most powerful people never go to prison. You know, and I wrote about the Wall Street fraudsters and people who did torture and rendition. So when I was looking at these guys courageously sending billionaires and powerful politicians to prison, I thought it was a good thing. And when I went to go do the keynote speech, what happened was they asked me to do the keynote speech. I said yes, and they hadn't announced the 3 finalists. And then they announced the 3 finalists to get the prize. One was, as you probably remember, a journalist in Azerbaijan. The other was a journalist in Egypt, both of whom were under house arrest.
Yes.
And then the third finalist was the car wash task force. And there was like this left-wing pressure campaign aimed at me saying, we want you to withdraw from this event because the left, the hard left, really believed that they were corrupt by now. And I felt like they had violated a lot of rights and had made a lot of mistakes, but I still wasn't on board with the narrative that they were total criminals. So I went and I said that. I said, look, I have a lot of criticisms of them, but at the end of the day, sending billionaires and powerful politicians to prison is courageous, and it's something Brazil needs. And it was so ironic, Jimmy, because the week after I gave that speech, and you were there covering it for your show, that guy, Deltan, who, you know, is a big famous person in Brazil, he has like 1.5 million Facebook followers, internally in his chats, which obviously I now have and have read, he was saying, let's get Glenn Greenwald's speech and translate it and put it all over the internet. It'll help us so much with the left. And they did. They took my speech, they translated it, the part where I defended them, and he put it on his Facebook page and he said, the world-renowned, you know, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald gave this very important speech. And so he and I kind of like had chatted over the years. And then when I got this archive and realized I felt like betrayed because I had kind of gone out on a limb to defend them against the left. And it was just ironic because the argument that, oh, Glenn Greenwald's just a leftist trying to destroy this anti-corruption probe obviously was untrue because I had previously defended them. And they had a really hard time attacking my credibility as a journalist because every time they tried, I just quoted back to them exactly what that guy had said just like 2 years earlier. So a lot of people on the left had faith in that anti-corruption probe. It wasn't just you. And it wasn't just me. And, you know, I think it's not fair to criticize people for not being fully on board with that narrative until the evidence was available. And it was only available once this courageous source of mine gave me the evidence to prove it.
Yeah. Yes. So, yeah, that was a wild episode in my short career of doing the news. To have someone do that, to be bad faith attack 2 years after I covered an award ceremony that you were the keynote speaker on, and then you went on to expose the. Hey everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.